Welcome back to another episode of Brands Bites, bringing you the latest insights into the latest tech news, into the latest gadgets, and everything in between. And with that, let's check straight into the simulation and get started with our first topic, which is the triangle-wheeled bike gives new meaning to the word tricycle. Now, these YouTubers made a bike with triangular wheels. Now, impressively here, you can actually see that the ride doesn't look like it would be as bumpy as you would think. As you can see, a lot of it's getting absorbed right here. That said, if you pay close enough attention, it does look like it's maybe still a little bit, bumpy, which if you have triangle wheels, that'll get you. But yeah, bikes haven't changed in like 150 years, but here they are, building a custom bike. Now, I'd love to try this, other than it looks easy to, like, if you hit a speed bump going 20 miles an hour on this thing, okay, well, to start with, you want to go 20 miles an hour, but if you did hit a bump going 20 on this, would you just die because these parts would just snap? Like, especially the front wheel one looks extra jank. Like, what if the wheel hits that? I mean, is the wheel hitting that already just to help balance? It looks like the corners of the wheel are hitting that to help it, like, not go too high. But nonetheless, it's kind of cool. Yeah, such a weird thing to make, but, if you're a YouTuber, why wouldn't you make this contraption and get going on it? This looks so horrible to... Yeah, look how choppy every time that hits, it gets harder to pedal. Oh, that would be so weird to see in public, but I don't know. Glad to see people are still building and trying things. This is a weird one to go build and try, but why is there another article with square wheels? We're not going down another rabbit hole. But this is... YouTube enables so many people to do and like be weird on the platform, and this is no exception here. As you can see, they're doing weird things. Next up, we're going to jump into another happy topic before we do a couple downers. But Candela and Polestar unveil a new flying electric boat based on a Scandinavian design. Now, flying boat, don't get your heads too high here. It's not like it's got wings and will actually like take off. That would just be a float plane. But it does use hydrofoils. If you've seen hydrofoil boats before, they look pretty weird, and they're also pretty cool to see. The extra thing here is that it is an electric boat, which is also kind of cool to see. Two things you don't think that go together: electricity and water seem like a bad time. But this boat actually genuinely looks pretty cool. It looks similar to what you're used to seeing for like a wake boat, or should I say sports boat? That's probably the better one as a sports boat. There's no tower here for a wake boat. But nonetheless, it looks like your typical sports boat. And it does have a little futuristic-y look to it. And as you can see here, it actually has some pretty cool renderings of just what this thing is capable of. I just opened a photo. I don't know how to leave. I'll click back. Now, the seats here also look pretty cool. And it's actually deeper than you think it is, because it actually has like an inside cabin area. Nonetheless, you can see a couple speakers here, some cup holders, some presumably seats, because people like to sit when they ride in a boat. And that's in the front little cabin area here. And then you just got the main area with two holes here in case you want to, accelerate fast and send your passengers out the side of the boat. Totally capable of that. Now, with that, is there any specs along with this, or is this all just kind of its thing? Now, there is some specs to this, actually. Now, the Polestar Edition will achieve a range of up to 57 nautical miles, or 65 miles, 106 kilometers, on a single charge, while cruising at about 22 knots, 25 miles an hour for you Americans, and for everyone else, 40 kilometers an hour. Now, recharge has to be a pain in the ass on this then, right? Not actually too bad. I would say pretty typical to I'm going to say pretty typical to an electric car, but that's actually not true at all. Recharging takes about 2.5 hours on a 230 volt 3-phase outlet, or an overnight on a typical 230 volt 16 amp wall outlet. So slower than an electric car, but really cool. And as you can see here, this is what a hydrofoil boat looks like. You can see it actually sits pretty deep in the water when it's in the water, and then as you accelerate, you rise in and out of the water here. Some of the advantages of these hydrofoils is when they're high enough, they actually are great at sitting out of the water enough to like not feel the waves. Like you get a smoother ride because of this, and it looks pretty cool. And you can see you can lay down in the front there, and hydrofoil things just look so weird in the water, but they're cool at the same time. So Quintella has a bunch of other boats and stuff they build, but you got one big hydrofoil in the front and a smaller one in the back, helps stabilize you. Now, the other weird thing is because the boat's not sitting in the water causing a huge wake, since there's less displacement when you're at, whatever the top out throttle is here to get to the hydrofoiling level, you would make way less noise in the water because you're displacing less and there's no motors. So it'd be a weird, almost silent ride at the same time. Now, pricing for this will not be cheap. Pricing will start at $450,000, and production will take place starting in June, basically. 2024 is when deliveries will go out. So production is going to actually happen soon. They're building it in Stockholm, Sweden. Cool to see. It's actually, there hasn't been that much in the way of electric boats. One of the bigger questions is, in what way do you store the boat on, like if you leave it in the water all the time, how do you run power safely out there at this voltage for your boat and not have to worry about it at all? But yeah, when you are done, the hydrofoils can be fully retracted when not in use, which I'm guessing means you can also, in theory, go in actually some decently shallow water compared to not. Only downside here is I wonder if you do hit a if you do hit a rock, how expensive is that going to be? If you don't know exactly where you are, and that back rudder there, or back hydrofoil here with the propeller hits it could be in for a doozy. I mean, it could be a bad day on the water. But nonetheless, cool concept. Glad to see electric boats are on their way. Following up that here, we have Soundcloud is laying off 8% of its staff as it aims to reach profitability this year. Soundcloud has already gone through just some job layoffs not too long ago, in late August actually. And they laid off about 20% of their employees at that time. They're laying another 8% off now. And the idea here is SoundCloud is at a point where reducing the headcount is the only way to reach a profitable position this year. Now, this is a challenging but essential decision for them to hit that goal, because it turns out that running SoundCloud is not free. And while it is better than running a YouTube for free, SoundCloud is kind of in a weird spot where it's not anybody's main music platform. It's not their, it's not like a lot of people don't use it, but you either kind of use it or you don't, and it's in a weird spot of not being like a mainstream, because there's not a ton of like mainstream artists on there. But that said, there is some pretty good artists on there as well. Now, in the last few years, they've partnered with multiple labels to try and fix that, like Merlin and Warner Music Group. And it's trying to get its royalty program going and get growing and become more of that mainstream platform. But with things like Spotify and YouTube Music, that's going to be a hard area to breach. They have implemented some other cool things, like a TikTok vertical feed, but for music discovery. And basically, they're turning it more into a Instagram for music at this point, would be the best way to explain it. They're trying to get more engagement between artists and their fans, be able to communicate with them better, all on SoundCloud, which would be a different view for a music platform, but they're going to have to get some bigger artists on there if they want to hit that. That said, they have claimed that they have 130 million engaged fans, and it currently hosts more than 320 million tracks from over 40 million creators. Again, a lot of people that just like to make songs for fun. Some artists do get started on there and become mainstream artists, but you know where they stop putting their music? Is SoundCloud. Well, it is a great place to get started. There's just not the back end. It's similar to like if you're a Twitch streamer or a TikToker, you're going to end up on YouTube at some point, because that's just where majority of the money overall is. That's where everyone goes for their content, so you guys got to be there. And that's where SoundCloud is in a weird spot of they're not that platform. They're the get off the ground platform, the for fun platform. And we'll have to see how they're able to deal with that. It'd be great if they stick around. I enjoy SoundCloud for some songs that aren't even on other platforms, but they just, again, they're in that niche position of they've kind of hit their growth limit and they're not going to turn profitable by doing what they're currently doing. So their way of doing that for now is unfortunately laying off 8% of its staff. And speaking of laying off staff, if you worked for Virgin Orbit, you just don't have a job no more, because they are shutting down and having a bankruptcy auction, basically, which brought in about $36 million across multiple sales, which is not very much, all things considering. But Virgin Orbit was actually successful for a little bit. But Rocket Lab USA, a small satellite launch provider and aerospace manufacturer, bought Virgin Orbit's Long Beach headquarters which is 144,000 square feet, and they've bought a few other things. Now this isn't super shocking, and the now defunct Virgin Orbit started in 2017 as an offshoot of Virgin Galactic. If you didn't know, billionaire Richard Branson owns it. He owns, Virgin Airlines. He owns a bunch of other Virgin label and stuff like that. Used to be a bigger thing. And now its goal was the goal of Virgin Orbit was to use a modified Boeing 747 known as Cosmic Girl to deploy small satellites into low Earth orbit. But only 4 of its 6 flights were successful since its first in 2020, which is not a great look when you have players in the game like SpaceX who are more than capable of doing this and way more. And while this was a reusable thing, if you're only 4 and 6 successful, that's not great. SpaceX has a way better success rate. Blue Origin even has a better success rate, which people forget about them as well. Now, this company attempted to save money in methods like going public in 2021, most recently furloughing about 750 employees. However, that just wasn't enough. If you're not successfully doing flights 4 and 6, well, not bad is not super great. If your only thing you can do is get small satellites to low Earth orbit, that's not going to be enough. If you were going 4 and 6, but you were using an actual rocket that can go to the space station, go to the moon, can land and be reused, and bring satellites up there, they just didn't go broad enough. They went too niche too soon in the aerospace area of space. It's just not enough. Now, the company reported a $191.2 million net loss for 2022, and in April, they officially declared bankruptcy and laid off most of its employees. Now, it only earned about $36 million from bankruptcy sales, which isn't great, and most of that was $17 million, which they sold the airline, the 747 Cosmic Girl, to Stratolaunch, creator of the world's largest plane. A small satellite transport business launcher paid an additional $2.7 for Virgin Orbit's launch site. And yeah, I mean, it's too bad because I want more and more competition in this area, but it's still a little too early to go niche. There's not enough. The cost hasn't come down enough yet to make something like this where you can go this niche this early. It's just not quite there yet. And thanks for playing, but you didn't play hard enough. Next up, we have Waymo's self-driving cars will be available on the Uber app starting in Phoenix. If you don't remember what Waymo is, because they go in and out of the news all the time and nobody knows what's really happening, Waymo is Alphabet's or Google's self-driving car company that has been building self-driving vehicles that were supposed to be, the original idea, if I'm remembering correctly here, was they would have about a $10,000 add-on you could throw on any car and turn that car into a self-driving vehicle. Now that has changed many a times because it's Google and we're just lucky this product hasn't been killed off yet. But now they are basically building just self-driving vehicles like everyone else is, where that specific vehicle is the self-driving part, not an add-on to any vehicle. Here they have signed an agreement with Uber to use some of Waymo's autonomous vehicles just within Phoenix to do rideshare, which will be the first time that this is happening with a rideshare company where they're selling these self-driving cars to do this, which is kind of cool to see. And especially is a good way to make sure that Google's going to keep actually bothering to make these products. So good on them. Now, they're hoping to increase ridership by tenfold by next summer by partnering with existing ride hail and delivery platforms and try to do that. Now, Waymo could expand its reach and secure new customer beyond those who have already downloaded the company's branded Waymo app. So if you didn't know, Waymo, I believe, has an app in certain cities where you can have these self-driving cars come get you like an Uber, but this is specifically through Uber. It will be possible. I'm curious how this looks from like will the cars get wrecked easily? How will people treat the cars if nobody's there with them to like keep an eye on them? How does all that work? How does liability and all that? There's a lot of things to be figured out here yet. But this is cool to see, and I'm glad that they're finding partnerships like this. Elon has talked for a long time about Tesla doing these things where your car would go work for you, basically, and make you money during the day by doing these services. But whatever, they're actually doing it. Now, the first phase of the partnership will start later this year in Metro Phoenix area. And earlier this month, Waymo doubled its service area in the region to 180 square miles, including downtown, the airport, and Arizona State Universities, and other East Valley suburbs. So a big deal to include the airport and the university. Those are two big areas if you want to get more people to ride in your vehicles. And a set number of Waymo vehicles will be integrated into both the Uber and Uber Eats app. So not only will your autonomous vehicle bring you your food, it can also drive you places because you want that. It'd be interesting to see, depending on how these, I believe they're electric vehicles, so to see how long charging and all that takes, how that's all going to work out as well. There's just a ton to figure out. Cruise, one of Waymo's biggest competitors, also operates its own app and service in addition, creating testing and deployable self-driving technology. But the company hasn't announced any plans yet to basically join in on these ride-sharing services, but wouldn't be surprising if they do. Waymo is leading the way somehow all of a sudden in these self-driving services like this, and it's great to see. We'll have to see what ends up happening here and how profitable this ends up being if you're splitting. There's no driver to pay, but in terms of splitting between Waymo and Uber, how does that look with the car maintenance and everything? Or is Waymo kind of happy to just have the car get some miles? Or how does an accident work if you're in a car with no driver? There's a lot of things that have to get figured out as things go on here, because if you're sitting in the back seat of your car and you're texting away because the car's self-driving, it's not you driving, and then somebody sideswipes you or the car like blows a stop sign and plows into somebody, do you have to get out and deal with, like, is that your problem now as the rider to deal with that? Because that's a huge waste of your time versus like your driver's got to take care of it. Obviously, you'd probably be staying there anyways for the police report, blah, blah, blah. But there's just a lot of weird scenarios that could happen with a system like this. Next up here, everybody hates that you have to flash your ID to get alcohol, especially younger, underage people. Not recommended, but they know their ways around that. But what if you no longer need your ID to buy alcohol? Well, Amazon has got you covered. Everyone has seen their Amazon Go stores where you scan your app on your way in, the store tracks you as you go around, you leave with your stuff, just throw it in your bag, and they charge you on your way out, you're good. Now, their new thing is palm recognition. And by using palm recognition, you will not need AID to buy alcohol, which is fascinating. You won't need to show your license anymore. Once you set it up, you'll be good. Now, they've already partnered with Panera for their Palm ID, if I remember correctly, and that'll let you access your Pandora membership card and enter your like code on there on the phone app, and then you'll be able to just pay with your Palm when you're at the store. You don't need anything with you. Totally easy, good to go. Now, apparently, this is also supposed to be going with alcohol, and where this is going to be starting in places is, oh, it's all over the place here. But when used to do things so far like a Panera membership to a purchase in the store, Coors Field, home of the Colorado Rockies Major League Baseball team, is looking to take things to the next level, using it as age verification. So basically, if you enjoy the Colorado Rockies Major League Baseball team, you might be able to go there and not use your ID to get alcohol, which would be pretty cool. Also, it'd be sweet if you wouldn't even need your ticket, and as you're walking in, you just scan your palm, you're in, you go through security, boom, boom, bam, Bob's your uncle, and you're in the stadium. And then you just go get your beer and scan your palm, pay, and bam, you're good. Everyone would love to see that. I'd love to see how this goes. Crazy that this technology is already getting here, but as we allow these companies to scan more and more of our body parts, they build a way better profile on us, and we get way, way easier to track. It's a lot easier to track you with your palm than it is to track you with just a plastic little 3.5-inch ID card. But I have a feeling that convenience will always trump everything, and this will be no exception. We're going to see Amazon's Palm ID just take over here and become the main way that people do things. I mean, who wouldn't want to be like, I forgot my ID, but I need gas. And I want to grab a 12-pack, and then you go to the gas station, you're like, oh shit, I can just scan my palm and get both, and we out of here? That's going to win every time. That's just how it's going to be, because that's how convenience wins for everyone. Now, next up here, we have an update on our Montana TikTok thing. TikTok is now suing the state of Montana to overturn its statewide app ban. So, as you remember, Montana already announced that they're going to ban TikTok within the state by next January, I believe it was, and basically citing national security concerns linked to the Chinese owner. And TikTok, for whatever reason, is the Chinese company that everyone has decided to go after. They've slowly gone over other ones like DJI and Huawei, and they're slowly cracking down on these companies. And TikTok has been the one in the face because it's the one in front of people's kids, and now TikTok is getting the most aggressive stuff thrown directly at it. With that said, I would just like to point out that with the Huawei ban, there's still a ton of stuff that use it. Yeah, so Huawei devices are still being used on the used in places. They just can't be used as new products anymore. So the ban was kind of whatever. Still a lot of questions with if this will be, how likely this will be to make it through. That said, TikTok is using the Constitution against them, saying basically, it is unconstitutional to ban TikTok to protect our businesses and hundreds of thousands of TikTok users in Montana. TikTok's worried about their business and saying it's unconstitutional to fully ban them out of operating in the place, but we'll see. We'll have to see, because this means it's going to escalate, and which means we're going to actually get to see where this goes. Now, suit says that Montana's concerned with the Chinese officials that can access data belonging to U.S.-based TikToker users are without foundation, claiming that the state has enacted these extraordinary and unprecedented measures based on nothing more than unfounded speculation. And that said, we'll see what really ends up happening here. Now, Montana's ban will not prevent current users from accessing the app. Instead, the ban aims to disrupt the app's availability by threatening a $10,000 fine for companies such as TikTok, Apple, and Google for each day it remains on the App Store if Montana residents can download it. Exciting to see where this goes, because these lawsuits are always crazy on who wins and how they win and why they win, and we'll see what Montana gets away with here. Camera overheated, so we're just jumping straight back in here. Meta was hit with a record-breaking $1.3 billion fine over Facebook data transfers to the U.S. Now, this is the largest fine of its kind, but it's definitely not the first one that's ever happened. Now, with that, EU regulators have ordered Facebook to stop transferring the data of EU citizens back to the U.S. Facebook says they do this because they need to transfer the data to the U.S. to get more targeted ads so that they can send it back to EU and give it to the consumers that use the platform over there. But after complaints that stem back to 2013 and revelations by whistleblower Edward Snowden about the U.S.'s mass surveillance programs that go on around the world, including in the U.S., which I think the Twitter files has shown is something they do actually fairly aggressively in the US. That said, EU wants it to stop. So with that, Ireland's Data Protection Commission, who has assessed this fine, said that the current legal framework for data transfers to the US did not address the fundamental risks and rights of EU users. Now, and that violated the GDPR, and the fine exceeds the previous EU record of 746 million. I believe that's euros, so in US dollar, that's probably closer to 850 million. But that was leveled against Amazon in 2021 for pretty similar privacy violations. The very fascinating part of this is that they decided it was worth an extra 500 million, making it a massive fine. And the EU recently, I would say, is on a roll for making these fines actually hurt the company instead of just be another fine. And so transferring the data to the US, again, is critical for Meta's vast ad targeting operation, which relies on processing multiple streams of personal data from its users. And last year, Meta said that it would be forced to consider shutting down Facebook and Instagram in the EU if it wasn't able to send data back to the US. That seems like something they just say to try and blackmail EU lawmakers. And the reason I say that is because they will ultimately look and go, wait, we actually make like a ton of money from our EU people, and we could actually have things happen quicker and better if we had servers there anyways. Therefore, why wouldn't we put our equipment there? That just doesn't make sense. So I think at the end of the day, they probably would put some servers there and do some processing in the EU if they were forced to, just like Apple with the iPhone and the Type-C versus Lightning. At the end of the day, Apple's going to make a USB-C iPhone because that makes more sense than not. And so we're going to probably see that happen here at some point, assuming this keeps going the way it is. So previously, these data transfers were protected by a transatlantic pact known as the Privacy Shield. But this framework was declared invalid in 2020 after the EU's top court found that it did not protect basically the data of EU residents from being scraped by the US surveillance programs, which, if we're all honest, should also be taken into account here in the US, that they do this. And this ruling was not given a response by acclaimed Australian lawyer Max Schrems, whose legal battle against Facebook dates back to 2013, and original Snowden rev. Edward Snowden started all this stuff, basically. So now, although Meta has been ordered to stop these data transfers, there are a number of caveats that benefit the US social media giant. First off, the ruling only applies to data from Facebook, not from their other companies like, you have Instagram, you have WhatsApp, and second, there is a 5-month grace period before it has to stop these transfers entirely. This grace period partially makes sense because it is probably a ton of data to figure out what they're going to do with, and they need time if they're going to build the infrastructure, even a quick build of infrastructure just to be able to do that in the EU if that's where they decide to take it. Now, there is a further 6-month deadline to stop holding its current data it holds in the US. So in that 6 months, Meta could definitely throw up servers in the EU and transfer all that data over and not lose anything if they really wanted to. That said, third and most important, the EU and US are currently negotiating a deal to transfer data that could be in place by early this summer, as late as October. So this is a massive problem for Meta right now that could be gone by October, and we're going to have to wait and see if that's actually what goes on, if they end up making this deal or not. But despite the record-breaking size of the fine, experts doubt that it will change anything fundamental with Meta's policy. Like I said, I think all this will do is Meta will look at it and go, if we're going to be forced to do this, we're going to tell you we're going to pull out until it's in place, and then once it's in place, we'll build some servers over there, we'll process data over there, and move on with life. Now, to be fair, if they really wanted to, if they were really giving this data to the US government, they could still do it with servers in the EU. That doesn't, at the end of the day, it doesn't change that much, other than it might be a little harder, might take a little more time. There's still plenty of things that are going to go on here, but Meta itself describes the fine as unjustified and unnecessary, which they're partially right, and they're also, on the other hand, if you care about your privacy and all the data that's collected on you, they're not right, but those people probably don't use Facebook anyways. But great to see that the EU is trying to do something about it and protect their people. That said, I'm sure the EU is partially doing this so they can also just collect the data instead of only the US collecting the data. So kind of a double-edged sword, if you ask me. But they're whatever. That's what the EU wants to do with their citizens. That's what they're going to do, I guess. Lastly, here, we've talked about T-Mobile becoming the #1 provider before with wide margins, and with their acquiring of Sprint and how quickly they've implemented 5G, whether it's true 5G or not, that's to say, but nonetheless, they kind of became the #1 cell carrier, with Verizon the only close following one, and then you kind of had AT&T in the back, and pretty much everyone else that you think of, your Metro, your, I don't know, you name it, any other of those like smaller providers probably use AT&T or Verizon or T-Mobile's networks. That said, T-Mobile announced a massive deal to work with SpaceX and Starlink to also use Starlink's newer satellites to give connection to T-Mobile users anywhere by using satellites instead of cell towers to basically fill in the gaps of T-Mobile's cell coverage. AT&T, however, is not a fan and is trying to block this, but not quite for the reason you would think. Not because they couldn't go sign a deal with Starlink and do this as well, not because it's anti-competition for T-Mobile to be just plowing over the competition with all these deals, but more because AT&T and a rural telco say Starlink field phone services would cause interference. Basically, what AT&T is trying to say here is that if this deal goes through, that spectrum that they're going to use, that the FAA opened up for SpaceX and T-Mobile to use together, would interfere with AT&T's connections in these rural areas, which is exactly what this exact signing with Starlink and T-Mobile would fix for T-Mobile. But what's happening here, AT&T urged the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, to reject SpaceX and T-Mobile's proposal. The FCC's rules do not permit SpaceX proposed use of T-Mobile's terrestrial spectrum, and applicants failed to even request, much less justify, rule waivers that be necessary to authorize their proposed coverage from space, basically. So again, saying, hey, this is going to cause a problem, and this shouldn't be allowed. Their own rules shouldn't allow this. But it said, AT&T has said its interest in the proceeding is because it has a license to use the adjacent spectrum in the PCSC block. So if you have your spectrums of connections, FCC gave SpaceX and Starlink and T-Mobile access to this one to use for their connection. AT&T wants to use the one right next to it, and they're basically saying they're too close. We're going to have communications that are going to get jumbled. They're connections that are going to interfere with each other and cancel out, cause problems. So SpaceX and T-Mobile's technical showings are willful and insufficient regarding the risk of harmful interference proposed by their planned SCS deployments, AT&T told the FCC. This just happened, so we don't really have much data beyond this, other than this is a pretty, actually fair way for AT&T to go after this out of all the ways they could. But what does this really affect for T-Mobile and Starlink? This is actually a giant deal, because about 7,500 satellites could be affected by this. So the FCC last month sought to comment on the application, noting that SpaceX requested modification of its license for low orbit Earth satellites to add direct-to-cellular communications capable of up to 7,500 Gen 2 Starlink satellites. These are ones they're launching this summer. These are satellites that are going to possibly going up now. This is very similar technology to the company that Apple is working with to provide their emergency services, where you can call from pretty much anywhere on an iPhone and get connection to a police station, a fire station, whatever you might need. So this is very similar that way, other than this will just be used all the time. You'll always have access to this. So the link to consumer devices would rely on 1910 to 1915 megahertz Earth to space and 1990 to 1995 megahertz space to Earth bands, known as the PCSG block, the FCC said. Now, the FCC is on board with satellite companies and mobile carriers partnering to close gaps on wireless networks. This is a pretty big deal in places where you don't have any internet access or cell coverage, where you might still only have satellite connections, Starlink has a much stronger, much more powerful connection in those areas, and this is one of the ways that you could get that out to people that don't have internet, which you could argue is extremely important to get everybody with internet. In a lot of people's lives, me included as a photographer, the internet is more of a utility for me at this point than just a thing I use for fun. I need it for work. I couldn't do my job without it. So I do actually need it. And there's other people that need it as well, and this aims to bring it to them. So the FCC proposed a new regulatory framework to help satellite operators and wireless companies, leveraging the growth in space-based services to connect smartphone users in remote, underserved, and unserved areas. But the FCC could still reject or require changes to their plan that T-Mobile and SpaceX has. I doubt it, since they've already kind of let it go, and AT&T is kind of just late to the game here. So SpaceX said recently it plans to start testing the satellite to cell phone system with T-Mobile later this year, which as a T-Mobile user, I'm actually excited for, because this service, even in congested areas like a city, could possibly free up more bandwidth and give you a better connection in congested times in those areas. So it actually could be beneficial, not even just for rural people, but for people that live in a city. And with that, a rural wireless group has similar objections that it's going to cause issues with theirs. To an extent, I think this happens all the time, where you have people complaining about bands that are going to be going back and forth. Now, yesterday, the FCC sided with SpaceX in a separate battle over the spectrum use. As reported, the FCC rejected a Dish Network proposal that for mobile service in the 12.2 to 12.7 gigahertz band, saying Dish plan could be harmful for interference to satellite broadband services. So it is possible that the FCC could rule with AT&T. It depends on how established AT&T's service, I would say, is compared to what SpaceX is about to accomplish with launching all these satellites. Also, there's some trickery here with 7,500 satellites going up. How much does that benefit the government? Is that going to sway them? A lot of questions here. But AT&T says no, you are not allowed to use your satellites to phone services just yet. I want something to say about that. And we're going to see what ends up happening with that. So with that, I hope you enjoyed this episode of the podcast. I'll catch you guys in the next one. See ya.